While Washington debates and delays, one state decided it wouldn't wait anymore. Florida has spent over $1.3 billion in the last few years on what Governor Ron DeSantis calls the most aggressive state-level response to illegal immigration in American history. From deploying National Guard troops to the southern border, to flying migrants to Martha's Vineyard, to passing some of the strictest immigration enforcement laws in the nation, Florida isn't asking for permission. But here's the question nobody's answering. Is any of it actually working? Today, we're diving deep into Florida's controversial, expensive, and unprecedented attempt to solve a crisis that's technically not even theirs to solve. To understand what Florida is doing, you first need to understand why they're doing it. Florida isn't a border state. It doesn't share a fence with Mexico or face the daily influx that Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California deal with. But Florida's governor and legislature argue that the border crisis is Florida's crisis, and they've got numbers to back the claim up. According to state officials, Florida has seen significant increases in what they call illegal immigration-related costs. They point to healthcare expenditures for undocumented immigrants, education costs for students without legal status, and law enforcement expenses related to human trafficking and drug smuggling operations that originate at the southern border. In 2023, Governor DeSantis stated that Florida hospitals spent hundreds of millions providing emergency care to undocumented immigrants. The state's Department of Education has reported increases in students requiring English language services, and law enforcement agencies across Florida have documented arrests connected to transnational criminal organizations, particularly involving fentanyl trafficking. But here's where it gets complicated. Immigration enforcement is constitutionally a federal responsibility. States don't have the authority to enforce immigration law the way the federal government does. So what Florida is doing exists in this legal gray zone, pushing the boundaries of what states can do when they believe the federal government isn't doing enough. Let's talk money, because Florida is spending a lot of it. In 2023 alone, Florida allocated approximately $12 million, specifically for migrant relocation programs. That's the program that made national headlines when the state flew migrants from Texas to Martha's Vineyard. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The state committed $8 million to send Florida National Guard troops and law enforcement officers to Texas to assist with border operations. Another $15 million went to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for what they call enhanced immigration enforcement activities. Then there's Senate Bill 1718 signed into law in May 2023, which came with its own massive price tag. The state allocated funding for an entire enforcement apparatus, hospital reporting requirements, employment verification systems, and legal challenges that everyone knew were coming. Add it all up, and Florida has committed well over $1 billion in recent years to immigration-related initiatives. For context, that's more than the state spends annually on some entire government agencies. The question is, where exactly is all that money going? And what is it actually accomplishing? Florida's strategy isn't just one thing. It's a multi-pronged approach that touches everything from law enforcement to healthcare to employment. Let's break down each component. First, there's the migrant relocation program, probably the most controversial piece of Florida's strategy. In September 2022, Florida used state funds to fly approximately 50 Venezuelan migrants from San Antonio, Texas to Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The flights cost around $615,000, working out to more than $12,000 per person. Governor DeSantis defended the program as a way to make northern sanctuary cities and states share the burden of the immigration crisis. The argument goes like this. Places like Massachusetts advocate for welcoming immigration policies, but don't experience the costs and consequences the way border states and Florida do. By sending migrants to these locations, Florida forces them to put their money where their mouth is. Critics called it a political stunt that used vulnerable people as props. Lawsuits were filed, including one alleging that migrants were misled about where they were going and what awaited them. Some of the migrants reportedly thought they were being taken to Boston and were promised jobs and housing assistance. The legal battles are still ongoing, but Florida has defended the program and suggested it would continue. The state set aside $12 million for these relocation efforts, though it's unclear how much has actually been spent and how many migrants have been relocated in total. Then there's Florida's deployment of law enforcement and National Guard troops to Texas. Starting in 2021, Florida began sending state resources to the southern border to assist Texas with what both states describe as a border security crisis. These deployments have included Florida Highway Patrol troopers, Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission officers, and National Guard soldiers. At various points, Florida has had over 1,000 personnel stationed in Texas, conducting surveillance, assisting with vehicle inspections, and providing logistical support. The cost has been substantial. Deploying personnel out of state requires paying salaries, per diem allowances, transportation, equipment, and more. Critics have questioned whether Florida taxpayers should be footing the bill for operations in another state, especially when Florida has its own law enforcement needs. Supporters argue that the border crisis affects all states, not just those on the border, and that Florida has a right to protect its interests proactively rather than waiting for problems to arrive at home. Now let's talk about Senate Bill 1718, because this is where Florida really went all in. Signed into law in May 2023, SB 1718 is one of the strictest state-level immigration enforcement laws in the country. It touches nearly every aspect of life for undocumented immigrants in Florida. Here's what the law does. It requires hospitals that accept Medicaid to ask patients about their immigration status. Hospitals must track and report the costs of providing care to undocumented immigrants. The law doesn't prevent hospitals from treating people, but it creates a data collection system that Florida says it needs to understand the true cost of illegal immigration. The law invalidates out-of-state driver's licenses issued to undocumented immigrants. So if someone has a driver's license from a state with more lenient policies, that license isn't valid in Florida. This has created concerns about people driving without valid licenses and the impact on road safety and insurance. SB 1718 criminalizes the transportation of undocumented immigrants into Florida. If you knowingly transport someone into Florida who lacks legal status, you could face felony charges. This provision has been particularly controversial because it potentially criminalizes family members, churches, and humanitarian organizations. The law increases penalties for employers who hire undocumented workers. Businesses with more than 25 employees must use the federal E-Verify system to check employment eligibility. Violations can result in suspension of licenses and significant fines. It allocates funding for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to create a dedicated office to investigate violations and enforce these new provisions. This isn't just a law on paper. Florida is building the bureaucracy to actively enforce it. The law also targets what Florida calls sanctuary cities, prohibiting local governments from having policies that limit cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. Any jurisdiction found in violation can lose state funding. When SB 1718 passed, immigrant advocacy groups immediately challenged it in court. They argued that immigration enforcement is a federal power and that Florida is overstepping its constitutional authority. They also raised concerns about racial profiling, civil rights violations, and the chilling effect on immigrant communities. Some provisions have faced legal challenges, but much of the law has been implemented and is currently in effect. So what's actually happening on the ground in Florida since these policies were put in place? The effects have been mixed and, in some cases, unexpected. Let's start with the labor market, because this is where some of the most immediate impacts have been felt. Florida's economy relies heavily on industries that have traditionally employed significant numbers of undocumented workers, agriculture, construction, hospitality, and landscaping. When SB 1718 passed, there were reports of workers leaving the state, fearing enforcement and prosecution. Agricultural associations raised alarms about labor shortages during critical harvest seasons. Construction projects reported difficulty finding workers. Some businesses claimed they were following the law, but struggling to fill positions that American workers simply weren't applying for. Supporters of the law say this is evidence the law is working, that it's creating pressure for businesses to hire legal workers and offer better wages to attract American citizens. Critics say it's causing economic harm without actually solving immigration issues, just pushing people to other states. Healthcare has been another flashpoint. The hospital reporting requirements have generated controversy. Healthcare advocates worry that undocumented immigrants will avoid seeking medical care, even in emergencies, out of fear that their information will be reported. This could lead to worse public health outcomes and potentially more expensive emergency care down the line. Some hospitals have reported that the data collection is administratively burdensome and that patients are confused or frightened by immigration status questions. The data Florida is collecting is supposed to help the state make its case for federal reimbursement, but critics question whether the cost of collection and the potential health consequences are worth it. Law enforcement implementation has varied across the state. Some sheriff's offices have embraced the enhanced enforcement role, while others have been more cautious, citing concerns about community policing and the importance of maintaining trust with immigrant communities who might be victims or witnesses to crimes. The transportation provision has been particularly controversial. There have been reports of people being charged with human smuggling for giving rides to family members or co-workers. Defense attorneys argue that the law is vague and creates a minefield for well-meaning people who might not know someone's immigration status. Education has seen impacts too. Some schools reported decreased enrollment, with families either leaving Florida or keeping children out of school out of fear. This creates its own set of problems, as children missing education affects long-term outcomes, regardless of their immigration status. The relocation program remains divisive. While Florida officials touted as successful in raising awareness about border issues, the actual impact on immigration patterns is unclear. The number of people relocated is tiny compared to the overall immigration numbers, and critics say the per-person cost is absurdly high for what amounts to a political statement. Here's the trillion-dollar question. Is any of this actually working? Are Florida's policies achieving their stated goals? This is where it gets tricky, because the answer depends entirely on what you think the goals are. If the goal is deterrence, getting undocumented immigrants to leave Florida or avoid coming in the first place, there's some evidence this is happening. Reports suggest some undocumented immigrants have left the state, though hard numbers are difficult to come by. Labor shortages in certain industries suggest workforce changes. But if the goal is solving the broader immigration crisis or significantly reducing the undocumented population in Florida, the impact is far less clear. Immigration patterns are driven by complex factors, including violence, poverty, and opportunity in countries of origin, as well as federal immigration policy and enforcement. State-level actions can influence things at the margins, but they're not fundamentally changing the calculus for most migrants. If the goal is raising national awareness and putting political pressure on the federal government to act, Florida has arguably been successful. The Martha's Vineyard flights generated enormous media coverage and political debate. Florida's actions have kept immigration in the national conversation and increased pressure on the Biden administration. But critics argue that political theater isn't governance, that spending hundreds of millions of dollars to make a point is wasteful, especially when the actual policy outcomes are questionable. The legal question remains unresolved. Multiple lawsuits are working their way through the courts, and it's entirely possible that significant portions of Florida's immigration enforcement regime will be struck down as unconstitutional. If that happens, Florida will have spent enormous sums on policies that ultimately can't be sustained. Then there's the economic calculation. Has Florida's approach cost more than it saved? The state argues it's spending now to avoid larger costs down the line. Critics say the economic disruption, legal fees, and administrative costs far exceed any savings, and that Florida would be better off investing in federal immigration reform efforts. Florida's approach exists in a larger context of state-level immigration enforcement efforts. Texas has pursued similar strategies, including Operation Lone Star, which has cost billions and involves deploying National Guard troops, installing border barriers, and busing migrants to northern cities. Arizona has a long history of state immigration enforcement attempts, including the controversial SB 1070 in 2010, much of which was struck down by the Supreme Court. That case established important precedents about the limits of state power in immigration enforcement. Other Republican-led states have watched Florida closely, and some have indicated they're considering similar legislation. Democratic-led states, meanwhile, have generally moved in the opposite direction, with sanctuary policies and protections for undocumented immigrants. This creates a patchwork of wildly different approaches across the country, which critics say makes the problem worse rather than better. Advocates for comprehensive federal immigration reform argue that this state-by-state approach is exactly why federal action is necessary. So where does this leave us? Florida has committed enormous resources to an unprecedented state-level immigration enforcement effort. The impacts are real: changes in labor markets, people relocating, heightened enforcement, and national political attention. But the fundamental questions remain unresolved. Can states effectively enforce immigration law, or is this ultimately a federal responsibility that requires federal solutions? Are Florida's policies sustainable both legally and economically? And most importantly, do these approaches actually address the root causes of immigration, or do they simply shift problems around? What's clear is that Florida isn't backing down. Governor DeSantis and the state legislature have doubled down on their approach, framing it as necessary action in the face of federal inaction. They argue that if Washington won't secure the border and enforce immigration law, states must do what they can to protect their citizens and their economies. Opponents argue that Florida's approach is cruel, ineffective, and unconstitutionally overreaching, that it wastes taxpayer money on political stunts while causing real harm to vulnerable people and disrupting Florida's economy. The coming years will likely bring more legal battles, more data on economic and social impacts, and more political fights over whether Florida's approach is a model for other states or a cautionary tale of overreach. What's happening in Florida is about more than just one state's policies. It's about fundamental questions of federalism, about what states can do when they believe the federal government is failing, and about how America will handle one of the most challenging and divisive issues of our time. Florida has chosen its answer. Whether it's the right one may take years to truly know.